Alright, picture this. You're walking through town and stumble across an impeccable mansion that's up for sale. The outside is in pristine shape, it's a masterclass of architecture, and its quality is of little doubt. It's evident that hours and hours of manual labor have gone into the place, leaving you impressed. There's an open house, so despite it being too crazy to afford, you venture in for a look, only to uncover that its innards are quite barren. There's an old worn-down sofa, a stove with only one functional burner, and where pictures should be hanging on the wall, there's nothing. The elements that would make it a home, such as the appliances that aid in daily activities, or keepsake items reminding us of those we care for and what's important to us, are just sorely lacking. Despite the outside beauty, a hollow feeling washes over you. The gorgeousness of the outside lifted your expectations, but they were met with a cold interior devoid of the things that make a house a home. As much as I hate to say it, that was my experience of playing Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, a gorgeous but empty mansion. The most striking element about this sequel is the presentation, rivaling some of the most pristine tech demos we've ever seen, showcasing the power of the hardware, flexing an unbelievable visual prowess, and backing it up with strong audio work. The texture work, the lighting, the shadows, and the animations are some of the best we've ever seen in video game form, even true while playing on an Xbox Series S like I did. But moving past the technical wonder reveals a game that would rather be a movie, leaning into cinematography over mechanics and presentation over proper storytelling. In many ways, Hellblade 2 feels like a significant step back from its predecessor. It may appease a gamer with an eye for art or a huge fan of the previous title, but for a more general audience such as myself, it's honestly going to leave them bored, unengaged, or downright confused. Muddled themes, a lacking narrative hook, and vague sequences rob the narrative of its intended weight, instead dipping too heavily into the melodramatic. And on the gameplay side, we see a total step back from Senua's Sacrifice, stripping away what little depth existed to inject combat and puzzles with more movie-making flair. And for me, it just didn't work. To be clear, I'm not saying that Hellblade 2 is a bad game because I don't think it is. I feel many people out there could play it and really enjoy it for what it is, especially if you're willing to meet it on its terms. However, if we're being honest, it's one that ends up being boring or uninteresting for those wanting to play a game rather than watching it. This review will be an attempt to explain the good and the bad, taking a middle ground approach, but for me personally, my experience certainly leaned more negative than positive. So with that, let's get into the full review. Okay, first things first, I saw a lot being made about this game's runtime, and yes, it is pretty short, clocking in at about 5 to 6 hours, and maybe an additional hour or two if you collect everything. However, that's not an inherently bad thing on its own. Plenty of great games are short, but they do a much better job of setting a player's expectations by establishing tones, themes, and gameplay quickly and then maximizing each second, whether it's done mechanically or narratively. For example, a short hike can be beaten within 2 hours, but it's still amazing. It immediately sets a goal for the player and then sets them free to begin exploring, never gatekeeping the experience behind tedium. It's rich mechanically for a 2-hour game and uses that as a catalyst for fun. Meanwhile, a game like Firewatch, of a similar length, succeeds by emphasizing the narrative. You spend a lot of time just walking, but it contextualizes the walking beautifully with well-written characters and a prevailing sense of mystery and intrigue. So what we have here are 2 short games that succeed in very different ways, one through gameplay and one through storytelling. The problem for Senua's Saga is 2-part. First of all, it's a sequel, meaning many players are going to come in with preset expectations on every element of the game, from mechanics to narrative approach to level design, and especially expected playtime. Senua's Saga departs from its predecessor heavily, being decidedly smaller and more linear with less gameplay complexity in both the puzzles and the combat. But most important for some will be the length, which is shorter here by probably a good 3 hours. That betrayal of expectations will be enough to turn off some players from the experience, but that's just the first issue. The bigger issue is that Hellblade 2's already short runtime is littered with sequences where the player is simply walking or slowly climbing, which makes the pacing feel incredibly slow, like a slug on a dry day, at least when it comes to gameplay. I'd estimate a solid hour of the experience are just these sections where Senua is walking, sometimes with the sprint disabled, listening to dialogue that the game hasn't given a good reason to get invested in, or that is being overshadowed by the voices that Senua is constantly hearing. Truth be told, I wouldn't want this game to go 3 more hours at the pace it does. It is a slog to get through, making the short runtime feel like a curse at first, but a blessing later. Anyway, the point here is short games are not inherently bad. But when you fill them with what feels like bloat, they're going to come off as a waste of time, especially if the player's expectations have not been met. So let's get into specifics a bit more, starting with what Hellblade 2 does well, and then moving on to where it struggles. It should be obvious by now that the presentation is absolutely a strength of the title, and it had better be given how much weight it's attempting to shoulder. The game looks incredible, truly. The way water flows and ripples, the jagged nature of the volcanic rock, how sunlight illuminates the world, the gritty facial animations, the primal swings of a sword in combat, and so much more just scream polish. You wonder why this game took years to make? That's your reason why. I even played on an Xbox Series S, and it still blew me away. I can't imagine how good this game might look on Series X or PC. It's a true technical achievement, and I want to make sure I give the game a lot of praise for that. I'm sure other channels that focus more on presentation and analyzing that element could say a lot more about it than me, but yeah, it's a painstaking recreation of what 9th century Iceland might have looked like after a severe volcanic eruption. And the game does a brilliant job of presenting that reality while still finding ways to break up the scenery. So kudos for such a job well done on that front. The same goes for the sound work that we'll certainly be seeing a few nods at the Game Awards later this year alongside of those visuals. This is a game you absolutely must play with a headset to maximize the experience. The music and basic sound work as you traverse the world is so well done, and anyone returning from Hellblade 1 will know that Senua suffers from psychosis, and one result of that is the voices that she hears, constantly whispering words of encouragement and doubt at her as she goes on this journey. The way you hear these voices is superb, coming at you from all directions, simulating what it might be like to live with the condition, even if it's only a fraction of the experience. To be quite blunt again though, I'm not sure everyone's going to appreciate that as much as me. It's going to come off as an inconvenience for some players, as much as it lifts up the character and provides a small sample of what psychosis sounds like. I fear that many players simply will not appreciate it on that level, and I think that's a valid opinion to have as well. For me, the voices do a great job of helping to put myself in Senua's shoes, especially considering she isn't the most vocal character. It helped me to get in touch with her more, but it's certainly going to leave some folks reaching for the mute button. So what we have here is a great looking game with great audio work, but when presentation is made a high priority to this degree, pushing the technology as much as it can, then the tiniest holes in the armor become all the more apparent. And in the case of Hellblade 2, they aren't just tiny holes. They are 2 massive black bars on your screen that never go away and constantly pull you out of the experience. The game runs at a different aspect ratio than most titles, and the result is this letterboxing that just permeates throughout the playthrough. Nothing pulls you out of such a believable world as much as 2 giant voids at the top and bottom of your screen. This choice was most likely implemented to maintain the graphical output, but it is completely distracting as you play. It almost feels like you're squinting, seeing a portion of the world. Panning up and down reveals more, but it disappears as soon as you center the camera, making the world feel sadly artificial. The game gives the impression that the team wanted to deliver a cinema-level experience, but in the pursuit of the best graphics, they had to compromise, resulting in these black bars that just look awful. And unfortunately, that's not the only way they compromised. So now let's look at the gameplay. There's 3 things to do in this second iteration of Hellblade: combat, puzzles, and slow walking. Lots and lots of slow walking. The greater emphasis on delivering a movie-going experience means that many of the systems from the previous game feel watered down. This is disappointing, as it's only natural to expect a sequel to push the ideas and concepts of the original work even farther, but instead we go backwards here. Walking. You are going to be doing a lot of that in Hellblade 2. The game is extremely linear, and there's so many instances in which you'll just be walking through the same rugged rocky terrains or magical forests, just waiting for the story to advance. You can sometimes do a slow jog to pick up the pace, but it's offset by the number of times you're forced to slow walk to watch the scene in front of you play out. It's like the controller has been yanked right out of your hands, stripping you of your agency as a player. And if I don't have much agency, why is this a video game instead of a movie? This feeling persisted and came to a boil late in the title when walking around a supposedly magic forest that brings out people's greatest fears and insecurities, robbing them of their will to go on in the process. The game presents this moment where you're supposed to choose between helping one companion or another, and I thought finally I was getting a chance to interject my own perspective into the story. Finally, a walking section was asking me to do something interesting. But no, my choice didn't seem to do a damn thing, so instead I just kept trekking on for the next story bit. Now, there are a few optional offshoots where you can find some collectibles, but they aren't anything special. You might get a little bit more lore or some backstory, but I can't say the characters here are extremely interesting, even Senua herself, sadly. Anyway, just prepare yourself for lots of slow walking and slow climbing. The opening of the game sums this up beautifully as you spend 5 minutes watching Senua drag herself up a cliffside. Yikes. As for the actual gameplay sequences, we have puzzles and combat, but unfortunately, both elements have been neutered to maintain the storytelling and presentational polish. The puzzles found in Senua's Saga are painfully easy, so much so that you don't get the impression you're solving anything. Typically, when puzzle solving, you must think each move out in advance to find the solution. But here, it's more of immediately identifying what you need to do and then acting accordingly. Whether you're searching the environment to find hidden symbols or inverting surfaces with a switch to create new paths, everything is relatively easy, although finding some of those location-specific symbols can be a pain. But normally there's just one switch to flip, and doing so will grant you the solution to any puzzle. Again, they don't want you spending too long thinking, they want you watching. So by simplifying everything, it ensures the game keeps moving forward. But with so much slow walking already existing, it feels like they got the formula for a game wrong. Less walking and more puzzles and combat would be preferred, but they went with the opposite approach here. On to combat, and it walks backwards from the predecessor by limiting the number of challenges you face significantly. Returning is the action combat system where your movement is limited, even more so this time around. You dodge and parry for defense, and retaliate with light and heavy attacks, with the option to occasionally slow time to get in some extra damage. In the previous game, this combat system worked well enough by offering up variety in encounter types. There were enemies with different movement and attack patterns, but most importantly were the bosses. These were tougher encounters that demanded more of the player's skill, learning their unique attacks and responding accordingly. There were numerous fights like this which allowed combat to avoid feeling stale, despite it all being relatively simple. But again, Hellblade 2 walks this backwards. There are only 4 to 5 types of enemies in this game: a basic enemy who does basic slashes, stronger enemies who hit harder requiring you to dodge more than parry, enemies with ranged attacks, enemies with a shield, and that's about it. These same enemies are trotted out time and time again. I mean, once you finish the opening chapter, you'll have seen pretty much how every other fight in the game is going to go. See the enemy, quickly identify their pattern, dodge, block, or spam attack accordingly, and if things get a little too tough, just use your magic mirror to slow down time for an easy kill. By the way, this mirror was super useful in the last game because it offered a real decision on when to use it, as it recharged slowly, but could save your bacon in a pinch. Not here. Each fighting sequence saw me using it like 2 to 3 times, which seemed ludicrous. It trivialized fights that were already easier than Hellblade 1. But the biggest disappointment in combat comes in the boss fights, or should I say, the lack of boss fights. Matching up against Surtur and Fenrir in the previous game was exhilarating, but those same types of encounters are stripped away here. There's one combat boss encounter in Hellblade 2, and he's just a basic enemy with more health, which is a shame. The other quote-unquote boss fights, if you even want to call it that, are against 2 titans. These encounters are epically scaled and are presented well, but they are mechanically strapped of proper player inputs. The fights aren't fights at all, but instead timed platforming sequences that get repetitive fast. Again, visually striking, but lacking mechanically. So nearly every fight in the game is interchangeable with any other, making it feel incredibly stale. Funny enough though, I wouldn't call it monotonous or tedious because the game doesn't feature a ton of combat sequences or even puzzles for that matter. They are introduced sporadically, like they're a concession to the story sections where you're just slowly walking around. You get this impression that the team didn't want you playing the game as much as they wanted you to admire it, like a gripping movie or a fantastic new TV show. You as a gamer are like a needy child and the team says, "Oh my god, fine, here's a combat section, but after this, you're walking through the spooky forest for 15 minutes and you're gonna like it." There's so little interactivity, and if you aren't drawn in by the story, the theme, the presentation, or anything else, you're just going to be wasting your time. It's unfortunate then that Hellblade 2's story is also a step backwards from the previous game. The original was the tale of a woman finding strength and resolve within herself despite losing the man she loved most. It was also a story of acceptance, coming to terms with an abusive upbringing that brought out psychosis in her. Senua dealt with a struggle that's familiar to all of us on top of a mental illness that heavily influenced her state of being. But she pushed through it all, and it resulted in a pretty heartfelt and touching story. It was like the ribbon that tied the previous game together, making it fantastic, but it left this one in a bit of an awkward position. It feels like they weren't 100% confident of where to go with this character, so what we get here is kind of a story about revenge, at least at first, and then it transitions into another thing. At the outset, Senua sets out north to stop the slavers that took everything from her and her people, including her lover. However, along that journey, she comes to learn more about the motivations of the slavers and the bigger problems these lands are suffering from. She makes new allies in the process, reshaping her initial goal, but it all does feel a bit strange. She becomes really sympathetic to people who took her lover, but the game never delves too deep into forgiveness as a theme to make it make sense. She sort of just forgets about the fact that these people pretty much stole everything from her. Instead, thematically, the game seems to be about confronting your fears head-on by finding inner strength, which was certainly an idea featured in the first game and arguably done better there. Senua grapples with doubt throughout the story, only heightened by the whispers in her ear brought on by psychosis. This is mostly true when she recalls the voice of her father, who always put her and her mother down when she was young. He's a poison to her soul, infecting her perspective on situations at times, but never lasting long enough to keep her down for an extended period. And funny enough, in this way, the shorter game length almost works against the narrative, as downtrodden moments aren't given enough time to leave a lasting impact before it's right back to a more confident version of Senua. It's sort of like a switch being flipped back and forth throughout the tale. Anyway, back to that theme of facing fears, and we see it play out relatively well between Senua, her companions, and her adversaries. Senua herself is shown to still have struggles, but she is able to push through them consistently, as is perhaps best displayed in this scene where she gives up her only weapon in a dark cave packed with enemies to protect someone else. This behavior, along with the results Senua gets, allows 3 locals to feel comfortable in following her, hoping that she is the savior that these lands have been looking for. And of course, without being too spoilery, her adversaries are shown to kind of be the opposite, right? They're the ones that succumb to the fear, the failure, and the previous ways of life. And by clinging on desperately to those old ideas, they walk down a bad path, one that Senua is able to save most of them from. All in all, it's a decent theme with a good message, but I don't think the execution of it was strong enough to feel impactful. The short runtime limits how much time we spend with the characters and expedites the speed at which change occurs. While the gameplay has such a slow feeling to it, the story feels like it's unwilling to hit the brakes and let scenes breathe to deliver their intended emotional weight. It's like once a cutscene ends, the impact or the feeling of that moment is gone instantly. I will say though, one thing that I did really appreciate about this narrative is how it continued to handle Senua's psychosis with grace. Despite coming to terms with who she is in the previous game, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of Senua's problems are solved and that her condition is miraculously healed. No, it's something that continues to persist, both haunting her and building her up at times, but never defining Senua on its own. Senua is shown not to be a psychotic person, but instead a person living with psychosis, which is such an important distinction in the fight against stereotypes that can often dehumanize people with mental disability. By not alleviating Senua of those symptoms, while still showing her to be her own person, the team continues to respect the struggles and reality of living with psychosis, at least as far as I can tell. I'm not living with the condition, so I can't say that with absolute certainty, but at the very least, it comes off as very respectful while maintaining the debilitating reality. So kudos for that. All in all though, as a sequel, I don't think Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 delivers nearly as strong as an experience as the first game. While graphical output has been pushed to its limits with animations, lighting, and texture work that's up there with the greats, other elements undermine that high level of quality, none more so than the letterboxing. Meanwhile, the gameplay takes a large step back, almost feeling like an afterthought at times. There's a palpable feeling of hesitancy, as if the developers were shy about offering up too many proper gameplay sequences that may undermine the presentation and the story they wanted to tell. And unfortunately, it's a story that isn't quite as resonant as Hellblade 1, often feeling rushed, resulting in a theme that doesn't quite stick the landing. While Senua's psychosis continues to be handled with nuance, the rest of the tale around her just feels flat compared to the previous entry, and that's a shame. Ultimately, this game will still be great for some players, but I fear that many returning from the first game will be left feeling a bit hollow or let down by it. You know that feeling you get when a sequel comes out and takes what was already a strong foundation and builds on it beautifully? Well, Hellblade 2 sort of feels like the opposite, a regression on nearly every front. And while it isn't a total flop by any stretch, it's decidedly a step backwards. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, what did you think of this review? I tried to do my best to not be too spoilery and not show too many good things and some of the better moments of the title, so I hope you appreciate that. I was trying to be a little more vague, so hopefully I didn't ruin the experience for anybody that, wants to play this game on their own. But what I want to know is if you have played Hellblade 2, was I spot on with this one, or did I get it totally wrong? And why do you think so? Let me know in the comments below. All in all, I'll say this, if you have Game Pass, I'd say check this one out if you played and enjoyed the first, but taper your expectations accordingly. Like I said, it's not a bad game, but it's just a letdown compared to the previous entry as it tries to accentuate presentation while leaving gameplay in the dust. The story ended up having to be a tiebreaker that would either lift this game or drag it down, and in my opinion, it really didn't work out. But hey, your opinion could be different. As for upcoming videos, I'm going to be covering the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for Elden Ring that's coming out here soon. And I'm still working on Persona 3 Reload, taking my time with it and enjoying it. But there will be a review of that someday too. As for this video, I appreciate you putting up with my voice. Definitely am getting over a little bit of a sickness, so I still have a little hoarseness going on in the voice, but I'm doing well and we're on the up and up. So anyway, thank you so much for watching the video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. Join our Discord, the link is below, and as always guys, have a nice day, and take care.